morning. Welcome to day 2 of Ensure Justice Being Crushed 2021. I don't know about you, but yesterday I was full and overflowing. I had so much to think about. There were so many highlights. If you want to add in chat what your favorite takeaway or your most challenging takeaway was from yesterday, please do that. Our partners at Orange County Department of Education are providing Spanish interpretation for Ensure Justice. Please listen to these brief instructions about accessing the live Spanish translation. Natalia?
Good morning to all. My name is Natalia Barca. I'm going to be your interpreter today from the Orange County Department of Education. I'm working with my colleague Jorge Ibarra. So I'm going to give some instructions in English and then we're going to provide them in Spanish. So as soon as the host enables the interpreting feature, you're going to be seeing 2 channels, one in Spanish and one in English, and you're going to see a glove and the ribbon that is in the bottom of your screen. So if you need a Spanish interpretation, please click on the glove in Spanish. If you're going to be joining us by a phone, iPhone or an Android phone, you're going to see 3 dots on the right, and then you're going to also enable the interpretation feature. We are going to share these instructions on the chat as well. I'm going to give the instructions in Spanish. Buenos días, mi nombre es Natalia Barca, soy intérprete del condado de Orange. Estoy aquí con mi colega Jorge Ibarra. Si ustedes necesitan interpretación, van a ver en la parte final de su pantalla un globo terráqueo. Por favor, hagan clic ahí y seleccionen la parte en español. Si usted está conectándose con un dispositivo móvil, ya sea un celular, un iPhone o un Android, usted va a ver 3 puntitos en la parte derecha y va a decir, por favor, seleccione interpretación. Selecciona la palabra español y ahí va a recibir las instrucciones. Thank you. You can enable it now.
Gracias. Okay. I'm so glad to be here for the second day. And I want to know how you are doing with the Whova app. I started getting messages. I loved hearing from so many of you, and I'm just overwhelmed with the creativity of an app that lets us feel at least a little bit like we are connected. Some of the remarks in chat about yesterday: loved Bella. Oh my goodness, does everybody love Bella? I had so many responses yesterday. Heidi and Dan were so inspiring and encouraging. Now, if you're thinking, oh, I missed that workshop, I wanted to go to that workshop, don't worry. Those workshops are available so you can catch up on Whova, and they'll be up there for 6 months. Everything from yesterday is available today. That's because of our amazing tech team, and we do just want to say thank you to all the people who have stepped up and learned new things. Are you going to a lunch meetup today? Please take a look at the opportunities. I have notes that the app is working great. I have requests to bring Bella back next year. Bella is definitely coming back next year. She's probably the star of Ensure Justice 2021 because she proves that trafficking victims who have been in a place where being crushed is what they experience have resiliency and come back and make a difference at national and international levels. So we're thrilled with that. Okay, I also want to especially thank Jorge and Natalia right now and our other translators. This has been an amazing opportunity to make sure that we provide access for our whole Orange County community, and I'm really grateful for them. The other group that I'd like to highlight this morning is our anti-human trafficking certificate adjunct team. And many of them have helped prepare this conference. They have been workshop speakers. They will be presenters in plenaries. And so just so you know who they are on the roster, it includes Ruthie Hanchett, Nicole Johnson, Beth Luthi, Jamie Manurakiza, and I'm sorry, Jamie, I didn't do that right. Kendra Tankersley Davis, Stephanie Taylor, and Alicia Zayas, and Paul Chang. Many of them have been guests on the Ending Human Trafficking podcast. If you are not a subscriber to the Ending Human Trafficking podcast, please go and sign up there. Brenda Navarrete is also adjunct. She's not on our webpage yet because she's brand new this year, and that's a note to self. Make sure she gets added to that. We do love our adjunct professors. One of the special reasons is because they are frontline service providers, and that makes a huge difference. Looking at where we were yesterday, thinking back through the beginning with our greeting from our partners from OC Department of Education and Dr. Al Mijares, the superintendent, really reminding us of the nexus between the MTSS, the multi-tiered student success program. Please go back, look at that handout on Whova online, and see how you can integrate that in your work in any level, anywhere. I also wanted to mention that we've had a great deal of response to Bishop Kitoto all the way from Kenya. And so please know that if you want to watch that, have some friends over to share, post, and share justice, that's available on Whova now. So I am not going to take up too much more time. People are starting to arrive. They all know the 9 to 9:15 is just going to be housekeeping, but it doesn't take as long online because I don't need to tell you where the restrooms are or where you can get water. So I'm going to jump right in and introduce my friend, our GCWJ adjunct, Priscilla Santos. Priscilla currently serves as the Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking Response Coordinator at the Salvation Army Social Justice Commission. I thought my title was long, Priscilla, but yours is longer. She's also adjunct professor where she teaches on justice and holistic survivor care. She's Cuban American, living in Los Angeles, California, with her husband, daughter, and son. As an Enneagram 7, she can't imagine life without meeting peculiar people, laughing, and adventuring. Welcome, Priscilla, and I'll let you introduce your panel. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Give me 1 second. My screen just went black. Can everybody hear me?
They can see you.
We can also see you.
We can hear you.
Okay, my screen just went blank. Let me see.
Do you have dual screens?
I do.
Oh, that might be, it may be going somewhere else.
Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. Okay, I am back and we are ready. Excuse that. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this critical conversation on race, ethnicity, new immigrant population, and its intersection with human trafficking. As Dr. Sandy mentioned, my name is Priscilla, and I have the honor of being the facilitator for this session. And as she also mentioned, I serve as the international coordinator for anti-trafficking with the Salvation Army International Social Justice Commission. And as I was preparing for this session, I was reminded of the Salvation Army co-founder said, if we are to better the future, then we must disturb the present. And just think about that term right there, that phrase, disturb the present. I know for myself as a person of color, a leader in the anti-trafficking movement. As a Latina myself, I am grateful for opportunities to facilitate these types of necessary and brave conversations. I know that we are all in agreement that we want to see an end to racism and human trafficking. And to achieve this, we must disturb the present racially oppressive systems and cultural norms which fuel human trafficking. It is time that we begin to have a comprehensive conversation about this matter in order to identify the root causes and to be proactive about dismantling systems that perpetuate this crime. In efforts to combat this issue, our conversations and practices must be racially inclusive. We must consistently discuss the connections between trafficking, migration, poverty, racism, and gender to destroy the roots of racial oppression and human trafficking. The notion that anyone can be a victim of human trafficking is true. However, the fact that the majority of victims are Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC, should not be undermined or understated. Just right here, where many of us call home Orange County, we also see that this is true in our own reality. According to the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force 2019 victim report, we see that from a total of 415 victims identified and served, 29% of them were Black, 24 were Hispanic, 13% were Asian, 15 were other, while 19% were white. And while this conversation about racial justice has been happening in other spaces and in other sectors, it hasn't been happening to the full breadth required within the anti-trafficking movement. So let's take the first step and let's talk about it. Before I introduce our panel for today and speakers for today, just a heads up that we'll leave some time at the end of the session for a couple of questions. So for everybody viewing the session today, feel free to ask any questions to our speakers on the chat box below, and I'll be able to go through them and figure out which ones we ask towards the end. So let's go ahead and meet our amazing panel. First up is Paul Chang. He is the Regional Anti-Trafficking Coordinator for the U.S. Department of Labor, and also co-chairs the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders Regional Network, where they collaborate with regional network members and other federal agencies to strengthen strategic community engagement partnerships in areas such as economic growth, law enforcement, immigration, vulnerable workers, and government contracts. Our other speaker for today is Catherine Mcgivens. She is a mother, an author, a playwright who is passionate about helping others. She was raised in Canada by her mother, who instilled solid family values and taught Catherine and her siblings the importance for standing up for what is right and speaking out for what is not. She is the program director for a nonprofit, an inspiring speaker whose hope is to use her story to encourage others in the fight. She has spoken passionately to faith-based organizations, medical professionals, and politicians. And Catherine believes that sharing her story contributed to her healing process. She is now helping others creatively share their stories in a way that does not re-victimize or re-traumatize survivors. She's dedicated her life to following these principles and beliefs instilled by her mother. Stand up for what is right, stand out about what is not. Speak out for what is not, excuse me. And then last, but certainly not least, First Lady Cecilia Nez. She is the First Lady for the Navajo Nation. She was born in Keene Canyon, Arizona, and raised on the Hopi partition land of the Big Mountains, Arizona. She is married to Jonathan Nez and mother of 2 children, Christopher and Alexander Nez. And she earned her Bachelor's of Science degree in Political Science and Criminal Justice from the Northern Arizona University. So now that you got a glimpse of who these dynamic kind of panelists are, let's go ahead and hear from them. So here is the first question to hear from our panelists. The question is, in what ways have you seen racial injustice and systematic inequity fuel and impact human trafficking in your specific context and in your community? We'll go ahead and start off by hearing from Paul Chang. And I did want to just mention that Paul, we stand in solidarity with you and the Asian American community right now with the influx of racial bias and attacks that are occurring.
Thank you so much, Priscilla, and thank you for that, for standing up. As you know, this is on the top of the agenda with the White House right now, and this is happening all over the country. But there has been a long history of this issue with anti-Asian hate, and this deals back all the way to the beginning of the founding of the republic. And when we look at it, after slavery was abolished, we had the coolie trades, and then as a result that worked on the transcontinental railroads. But as a result of that, as more Asians, especially Chinese, were immigrating to the United States, it threatened, I guess, many people, and that culminated with the first bill with actually a law that called the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So this again, as you heard the rhetoric as recently as the COVID-19 issue, culminated around the world, the anti-Asian, anti-Chinese hate has been more profound, and I think what happened with this was the rhetoric that was also being talked about, that this was a Chinese flu, the Wuhan flu and Kung flu and so on, that those really caused a lot of the issues, and as a result, people were not going to Chinatowns and so on. But how does hate and racism influence human trafficking, for example? I think the idea that the immigration story that many APIs, Asian Pacific Islanders, face, we're not a monolithic community. There are different issues facing different parts of the communities, and I think what it is that you may have people from the Philippines, immigrants from the Philippines, work on areas like farms, for example, or for taking care of the elderly, nursing, whereas Chinese immigrants will work in the perhaps restaurants, massage, and so on. And for example, Hmong farmers, Thai communities, various communities will have different backgrounds as well as industries that they work in. And I think what we don't realize is that each of the API community brings in a unique background, but also unique needs. And this is where an understanding having culturally and linguistically appropriate services is so important to address these needs. No matter where you're from, we may all look alike, but the thing is, we come from different cultures and we speak different languages. These are very important social as well as cultural norms that I think would really help if we had these types of services available to us, to our communities.
Yeah, thank you. I thank you for speaking to the APA really unique experience here in the States. Can you share a little bit more about how perhaps the APA undocumented community and how they are a greater risk to human trafficking, and maybe after they are, maybe those that have been trafficked, how does that affect their process of restoration and the process of bringing justice due to their legal status?
Oh, great. Thank you for bringing that up, because I myself, I grew up undocumented. I came to the United States when I was 5, and for a period of time, I obviously grew up in fear of deportation. One of my greatest fears in growing up was actually coming home and not being able to. I came with my grandmother, so I didn't come with my parents. So family reunification, number one, is so important. For this, and I didn't see my parents until I was in my mid-20s. That, but also, fearing that my only caretaker was my grandmother, who was an extraordinary woman, and but my greatest fear growing up was, not having her be with me, or separating her with me, because she had to work in order for us to survive. One of the things that you never know that if she would be back at night when she goes to work. This is one of those fears that I think every undocumented family has. And I was able to bring that experience when I was working on these types of cases, because these aren't just types of cases for me, because I take these things personally, because of any of these anything that happens to any immigrant family is like, I treat them as my own family, because that's where I came from, and that's who I still identify as. And, this is why it's so important, I think, to have, a cultural understanding when addressing the undocumented population, no matter where you're from. This is so treating them, undocumented workers as human beings is number one. That's the most important thing. But also recognize that identifying there has to be trust. Being there, but also there are also letting the people know that there are services, as well as the ability to get UNT visas, for example, if they were, if they were victims of trafficking, but also if they were abused because people used their legal status against them so that they will get paid. So these types of situations are something that we want to let the community know, and we want to make sure that the community can come to the Department of Labor, as well as service providers, and we are here to help them and not fear retaliation from the government, but also our service providers.
Yeah, thank you once again, Paul. Thank you so much for sharing your unique story and how it kind of connects to the APA unique experience, and for giving us a bit of insight and then helping us to really fuel empathy for this immigrant population. So once again, thanks for kind of sharing your story. Okay, we are going to pass the mic to Catherine. Same question for you. In what ways have you seen racial injustice and systematic inequity both fuel and impact human trafficking from your perspective? Kathy, you're on mute.
Am I still on mute?
Just no, you're good.
Luckily, I didn't say too much, right? So first of all, just thank you guys so much for having me join this panel. And like you said in the beginning, these are very important conversations. They're uncomfortable, but I think it's very important, especially in the work that we all do, right? Trying to end human trafficking, that's what we're here for. I always say that if you engage in conversations like this and you walk away comfortable, then you've missed it. We need to be uncomfortable because that's going to fuel change in us, right? So when I think of the anti-trafficking movement now and trafficking as a whole, I have to go back to, slavery, right? Women, children in the Black community, they were considered chattel, right? It's for so long. And we fast forward to like the Mann Act, which the White Slavery Act, where was like the first piece of legislation to like combat human trafficking, but it was specific to, it was called the White Slavery Act, right? So there again is like, even though we started that movement to like end human trafficking, Black people were not protected. They still weren't protected. And so fast forward, and here we are. We're talking about trafficking. Trafficking's a thing. It's a hot topic right now. We're all in it. And I believe that people's hearts are in it to stop it and end this thing. But what we have forgotten in a lot of our work is that people of color are still, they're disproportionately at risk for being trafficking, and they make up so much of the individuals that are being trafficked. So when we look at the anti-trafficking movement, we have to reevaluate all of our programs and agencies and say, okay, what are we doing to address that population? We can't ignore that population. We have to address that population. I know for me as an overcomer of trafficking myself, when I first started speaking out about my story, about my experience, it was just a healing. I started just as healing for me, right? And then I started realizing that, oh my gosh, like I'm sharing and there are other people that look like me that need to hear this. So I started sharing. And I remember in the early days of me first like coming out with my story, I would get invited to like all these press conferences and all these things, right? And I didn't look like how trafficking looks, right? Sensational, we sensationalize what trafficking looks. And so I didn't have the blue eyes and I didn't have the blonde hair. And here I am saying, hey, I'm a victim of trafficking. It was like, whoa. And I remember going to my first speaking engagements. And one of the things that stuck with me was that, people would look at me when I walk into the room and it was like, okay, she's about to be, is she really trafficked? And then after I spoke, they would come up to me and say, oh my gosh, like, you sound so articulate, like, wow, I can't believe it. So I would get comments like that. That was one of the first things that kind of like, rubbed me like, okay, so I'm a victim of, or I'm an overcomer of trafficking. You missed that whole point. You missed my whole, the whole spill about like the overcoming story. But what you got from that was that, oh, wow, she's Black and she's articulate. And so now I can start listening to her, and now I can start like listening to what she's saying about trafficking. What if I wasn't, or what if you didn't find me articulate? Would you still hear my story? Would you still hear my journey? Would you still hear the nuggets that that's imperative for us to do this work? Probably not, right? I remember, I used to, when I was, again, in my journey of speaking, when I first began sharing my experiences, there would be things like, hey, can you straighten your hair? Just because I know that, like people aren't going to receive you as well. When it comes to donors, I have to present myself a certain way, and so things like that. I would say they sound so simple and so small, right, to people, but these are the things that will prevent people of color from coming out. We already know that, you know, Black women, Black girls, because of the intersections related to poverty and maybe debt and unemployment and the wage gap and all of that, once they're in the life of trafficking, it's really hard for them to get out because they can't see another way to provide for themselves, their families, or their children. So already, you know, coming out as an overcomer, I already have to face these systemic barriers. But then when I'm told that, hey, calm it down a little bit, that completely belittles my story, you know, my experience. It makes me feel like I'm not valid. I'm not a valid part of this movement. So that is very dangerous too, like for the other women and the other girls and the other children and the other men and the other boys that are Black or people of color that are trying to say, hey, this happened to me. I believe I was a victim. Another piece that we have to look at is adultification, right? So a lot of Black women and girls, you know, they're perceived as older than they really are. Again, in the movement, in this anti-trafficking movement, I've been told that, you know, Black girls don't want to come out. They just don't want to get out. Like it's like they don't want to be rescued. Well, that's not necessarily true. The fact is that they have all of these layers of historical trauma that we can't get lazy in the fight of human trafficking, right? We can't just say, oh, well, I asked her if she wanted resources, but she resisted, she cursed me out and she left. We can't stop there because we have to address all of the layers that lead up to trafficking, right? So on top of trafficking, I have layers of historical trauma, generational trauma, I have systemic oppression, I have all these things that we have to intentionally, as allies and service providers, be willing to like peel those layers back. We have to be willing to do the work to get to that whole person so that we can address their trafficking experience. If you're not in it for that, then we have to take a step back and say, whoa, maybe I'm not cut out for this, right? Because the fact of the matter is, if you're in the fight against human trafficking and to end human trafficking, we have to acknowledge that 40% of trafficking victims are Black, right? Are Black girls. So if you don't want to go that extra mile to get to that whole person, then you have to take a look back and reevaluate yourself. So those are just some of the things, right? And then all of us, obviously, like the intersections of poverty, the criminal justice system, the education to prison pipeline, all of those things we have to look at holistically. So when I think that just the good advice for us, especially learning this and learning our part to fight human trafficking, we really need to look at it. We need to take a step back and look at it from a holistic approach and say, okay, we need to do better. We can't just address trafficking because under the label of trafficking is so many, many, many things. As an overcomer myself, I can tell you, I was exploited and sold for sex, raped repeatedly, but that was in addition to all the other stuff I had to deal with, right? That was in addition to like so much more. And then when we take these women out, we take these children out, these men, these boys that are Black people of color, and we say, here, we're going to get you resources and we're going to set you up for a good job and you're going to have just a wonderful life. Are they really going to have a wonderful life? Or have we addressed the fact that it's going to be 9 times 100% harder for that Black individual to actually succeed after they graduate from anti-trafficking programs, to get a job and to further their life and to get apartments and stuff like that? We can't just have them in our anti-trafficking agencies and say we're going to do this if we're not going to address, like, realistically, what does it look like out there to succeed as a person of color? So there's a lot to do in the anti-trafficking movement, but we can do it. It sounds daunting and overwhelming, but I guarantee you we can absolutely do it. If we just take a little piece of what we're supposed to do and do our part and do it well, I believe that we can.
Yeah, Catherine, that's so so many great nuggets that you mentioned. And I know that in our very brief email kind of dialogue about this session, you mentioned something really important. And it's not only looking at how victims and survivors are being impacted by racial discrimination within our systems, but looking at the trafficker as well. And I think one thing that I'm remembering from my previous role when I worked alongside human trafficking survivors was that we did a lot of our presentations was around misconceptions of who are victims. So a lot of what you mentioned, but then we also had to do a lot of re-educating on who are the majority of the traffickers look, and even what they would look like, because they also come with a lot of misrepresentation in the media and sensationalism. So, you know, the stereotypical where the trafficker is a Black male, this really wasn't the reality in Orange County, you know, from the traffickers that we were kind of seeing. And I know that you wanted to touch on that a little bit, and I was wondering if we could hear your perspective a little bit on that.
Yeah, the main thing to remember is that trafficking, traffickers and pimps, they don't have a profile. There's not one specific profile that we can just fit everyone in, right? And that's the same as for victims and survivors as well. But you know, we really, it's taking the easy way out when we say, oh yeah, you know, traffickers, pimps are Black. They fit this profile. That's who we're going to go after. That's who we're going to target. We're missing we're missing like a lot if we just pinpoint them, right? I know that, you know, we have to take a look at what trafficking really is. And so just understanding, and I think this is where talking and including overcomers at the table and in our work from conception to implementation is so imperative, because my story may be very, very different from someone else's experience. But if we take the moment to listen, you will hear other people tell you, other overcomers tell you, yeah, well, yeah, I did have a Black pimp, but also I had 5 white pimps as well. You know what I mean? Or like, actually my trafficker happened to be my parents, right? They'll tell you this. And we're listening to all these things and we're like, oh, it takes the blinders off to say, okay, traffickers are not only people of color, Black pimps, you know, with the gold chain, gold teeth, and that's not how they look, you know. Oftentimes, I'm not saying that they don't. Yeah, there are a lot of Black pimps, but there are also a lot of pimps that are white. There are also a lot of pimps that are mothers, right? And trafficking their own children. So we have to really, again, just be open-minded and listen to overcomers, listen to their stories. They will tell you, you know, they'll tell you who we're looking for. Also take into consideration too, that when it comes to demand, you know, there was a research that came out, I think it was in 2012. I think Rights for Girls put it out or something like that, but it was 85% of men who bought sex online were white men. So 40% of the 94% of individuals that are trafficked, 40% of them are Black, and 85% of the demand is white. There's a situation right there, right? And if we think back again, like I started with, you think back to slavery, how, you know, Black women, Black girls, they pretty much didn't even own their bodies. White men would take their bodies and literally dictate what they did, right? So they were called Jezebels, they were called all these things, and they were categorized according to, you know, what the white men labeled them as. And so fast forward, and here we are, and 85% of the demand is white. That is a harsh reality that we need to take a look at, right? And so we can't say that all pimps are Black and all demand isn't white. I'm not saying that either, but I'm just saying a large, you know, that study shows, but all pimps aren't Black, all demand isn't white. We need to look at it from a holistic, like an entire approach, and say, okay, what is it that we need to do and how are we going to address this? I think that the best way that we're going to do that is bringing more overcomers to the table. We can't have conversations to fix something without including the subject matters themselves.
Absolutely. Kathy, and I know that you're dying to share more about bringing more overcomers to the table, and we will get to that question next. But let's put a pause right there and hear from First Lady Phefelia, and then we'll come back to that question, if that's okay. So Lady Phefelia, we would love to hear from your perspective.
So in terms of, I had done a PowerPoint, is that, we're not showing that one right now, right?
Oh, if you sent your PowerPoint in, then yes, now will be the time to share her PowerPoint.
So when we're talking about Indigenous peoples, in the United States, we're talking about over 500 tribes, and some of these tribes are federally recognized and some are not. But I guess to get a good understanding for Indigenous peoples in the United States, we have to go back through federal Indian policy. And since the point of contact in 1492, it's evolved over time. And so 1492 to 1787, you're talking about initial contact and just a lot of tribal independence. There were a lot of tribes. We don't know for sure how many tribal peoples were on the lands at that time, but we know that a lot of them were killed off by disease, and European population increase during that time. Violence between Indians and settlers also occurred, increasing patterns of invading Indian territory and taking possessions. And then after the Revolutionary War, Americans began the systemic quest for lands. And then the second period, 1787 to 1828, agreements between equals. Indian tribes here were viewed as separate nations, and negotiations were done by treaty. Indian tribes were strong militarily, and they were still a threat, and laws were passed to protect against the taking of Indian land. A few of these laws, however, were actively enforced, and expansion was encouraged. So you kind of see that hypocritical stance through federal Indian policy. I guess in that way it can be worded and framed in a certain way, but the underlying intent is always something different. 1828 to 1887, removal and relocation reservation era. Here we have President Andrew Jackson urging Congress to act to remove Indians in the east to lands west of the Mississippi. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 led to treaties that forced most eastern tribes to the west. 1849 discovery of gold led to further expansion and decimated California tribal populations, coinciding with the establishment of the Transcontinental Railroad, westward expansion, and the prevailing concept of manifest destiny. In 1871, Congress passed law that stopped additional treaties with Indian tribes. In 1887, 200 boarding schools were established with 14,000 Indian forcibly enrolled. And most of these boarding schools, you're talking about the first one that was built, which was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And there's children being transported to that area of the United States from all other states. General Crimes Act of 1817, the Major Crimes Act of 1885 were passed, which authorized federal courts to prosecute Indians who committed certain crimes on the reservation. In spite of these policies, landmark cases, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831 and Worcester versus Georgia in 1832. These were landmark cases which laid the foundation for federal Indian law. The US ceases to see Indian tribes are no longer seen as independent nations. And then 1887 to 1934, we're talking about allotment and assimilation. Assimilation into white society becomes the new federal policy. In 1887, General Allotment Act, which is the Dawes Act, sought to extinguish tribal sovereignty, erase reservation boundaries, and force assimilation of Indian people into white society. Under the Allotment Act, surplus lands are sold to non-Indians. With destruction of the land-based, tribal culture is disrupted, communal life destroyed, productive land reduced, and outsiders allowed to live on Indian reservations. Congress allows Indian land to be leased to non-Indians, controlled funds that resulted from the leases, and determined when to distribute the funds. This later led to the settlement of the Cobell case. In 1924, Congress finally gives US citizenship to all Indians. And then 1934, 1953, we have Indian Reorganization. The Merriam Report, which was published in 1928, reported on the conditions of American Indians in more than 20 states. It finds conditions of abject poverty and extremely poor health conditions, which were common among American Indians. And this led to the 1935 Indian Reorganization Act. This law was enacted to protect the remaining Indian land base, encourage Indian tribes to adopt constitutions and engage in self-government. Under the IRA, many tribes adopt formal written constitutions, but these documents are based on an American democratic model that does little to incorporate tribal custom and traditions. The IRA has been criticized as paternalistic and ethnocentric. And then 1953 to 1968, we have termination of the federal trust responsibility and urban relocation. The IRA's goals were abandoned and termination of the federal government's trust relationship with Indian tribes became the new policy with the goal of assimilation. In 1953, Public Law 280 gave 6 states criminal jurisdiction over Indian reservations. And 1956 relocation program offered job training and housing assistance to Indians who would leave the reservation for urban areas. Many tribal governments were disbanded and reservations abolished. And then 1968 to the present, we're now in the era of tribal self-determination. Federal Indian policy change to one which promotes tribal sovereignty and self-determination. 1968, we have the Indian Civil Rights Act. However, since the 1970s, Indian interests have lost more than 80% of the cases that have been decided by the Supreme Court. Under laws like 1975 Indian Self-Determination and Education Act, tribes began running their own programs in education, forestry, economic development, and other areas, and employing their own qualified tribal members to administrate and operate them. 1978, we have the Indian Child Welfare Act. And then in 1988, Congress passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. And over time, we've gone to government relationships, and then the Indian Sacred Sites executive order, which was signed in 1996. So you can see over time just how the federal government has viewed and the relationship it has with the different tribes have changed over time. But for the Navajo Nation, we extend, our land base goes into 3 different states, but we can see how boarding school has impacted our people, the child welfare, removals of children and adoptions, how that has evolved over time, and just how important it is to try to keep Indian children with Native families. And then Navajo language and culture is another item that we completely support and stand by and defend. Historical territories, what we signed a treaty with the government in 1868, and over time we've added to that land-based, and so that's. But when you're talking about the land base of the Navajo Nation, the status, the types of lands we're talking about, we can talk about trust land, state fee land, allotments, checkerboards, and then you have disputes that happen. So there's the Benefreeze, the Hopi partition land, Navajo partition land, which resulted from the Hopi and Navajo land dispute. And then of course we have just for the Navajo Nation, I guess in a sense, we're very fortunate to have our very elaborate tribal justice systems, especially the courts and laws and policies that govern the Navajo Nation. We're talking about the NEF fundamental law, which is what the Navajo Nation courts operate on. In every Navajo Nation program, we have a DNEM model, which is based on the Navajo cultural perspective. So in every program, if you see a strategic planning document, you're going to see that it operates in this 4-point cycle. And then peacemaking, which is a form of restorative justice. And then even if you look at our Navajo Nation insurance policies, that covers being able to utilize ceremonies. And so some of those things are just very unique to the Navajo Nation in itself. But when we're talking about human trafficking, you can go to the next slide. When we're talking about human trafficking, and then its close relationship to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives, you know, the past few years, there's been a national spotlight on that. So there's been federal initiatives, state initiatives, and for us in Navajo Nation, there's been the states of Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona all had their own state groups, task forces. And then, of course, it comes down to the tribal initiatives. And I would say, you know, everything that's been done, the reports that have come out from the state and federal initiatives all point to, the recommendations all point to each tribe kind of addressing this. It needs to be initiated within the tribal lands, within tribal peoples. And just because every tribe is so unique in the way it's structured and the way it operates. And so that's something that's come out of those. And then the other portion to the correlations between missing and murdered and human trafficking victims. You know, human trafficking, there is, you know, unlike human trafficking, there's not a standard definition of missing and murdered Indigenous women relatives. But we do know that disproportionately Native Americans are affected by all forms of violence, domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, child abuse, and neglect, and all these factor into, they all contribute to people going missing, murdered, and or trafficked. So there's just a whole intersection of it. But what I will say is, we can go to the next slide again. But what we do know is when it comes to systemic and racial injustice, you know, just looking back through the colonial contacts and just how federal Indian policy has played out over time, we do have high rates of victimization, trauma, oppression, and poverty on Indian lands. And then you see the jurisdiction prosecution is probably the biggest issue that has come about. And a lot of the reports have talked about how Indian tribes cannot prosecute certain crimes on our own lands. And a lot of this goes into the hands of the FBI at some point. So when it comes to prosecution and jurisdiction, it really does come into play where certain cases were committed and who the victims were and who the perpetrators were. And then of course, there are not all cases are accepted by the FBI to prosecute, some are rejected. And when those things happen, you're talking about somebody else needs to come and step into, take that case, whether it's by tribal governments or by the state governments to prosecute those crimes. And data collection is a huge issue for a lot of, you know, even nationally, we don't have correct numbers. And when we're talking about data, we're talking about who collects them, what type of information is collected. We've seen certain data collection centers who don't even have a category for Native Americans. So just even little things like that, that does come into play. And then the sharing of data, who has access to it, all of that. And I know for Navajo Nation, that's a huge one, because limited resources and not having updated technology, if somebody were to ask us right now, we would say we don't have the correct numbers to even know how prevalent any of these things are. And then not having criminal analysts to really to do the job of collecting it and to analyze them for us. And then lack of support services. We all know we're in like rural areas. And when we're talking about support services, there's a true lack of them. And then lack of research on human trafficking of Native Americans. There have been a few done, but it needs to be something that's done, I guess, in on a long-term basis and covering more tribes. Deficiencies in trainings and resources to tribal communities is another one that's I've seen in a lot of the reports. Interagency cooperation is a huge one, just because a lot of these cases don't just happen only on reservation lands. A lot of these things happen across jurisdictions. And then the next slide. Healing from systemic and racial injustices. Some of these have been pointed out by some of the other speakers. Solutions must be Indigenous-led, tribal-led, with culture-based services and including ceremonies. This is where culture and language and just that whole spiritual aspect of healing comes into play, and just really that humane, I guess, aspect as well. And in Navajo, we have our clans, we have our kinship, we still have that here. So just to really bring those cultural aspects into how we plan out these solutions, and some of these processes and policies that we want to implement needs to have that component as well. Survivor-led policies and prevention, tribal anti-trafficking laws, some of these, and for Navajo Nation, I will say, just reading back through the reports, I think we have enough information now, based on what's come out of Operation Lady Justice and some of the state reports from Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and some of the other initiatives that have been started by other tribes. There's resources now, and there's help now that we can tap into to really start moving into addressing some of those gaps and some of those weaknesses in the systems that we saw from the previous slides. And so July 18, 2018, Navajo Nation Council signed a Navajo Nation law against human trafficking. And so we have that law into Navajo Nation. And then October 27 of last year, Navajo Nation received the Presidential Award for extraordinary efforts in combating human trafficking as a result of the Navajo Nation human trafficking law. So that's just from the Navajo Nation side. We can go to the next slide again. So in terms of recommendations, there's just a lot of work to be done, and when it comes to tribal peoples. Each tribe will have to determine for themselves based on their land base, how many people they're looking at in their population, just the structures of their government, and then of course how their laws, what their laws say about certain crimes being committed, whether it's on their lands or off land, but when their people are involved. And a lot of the things that have come out of the recommendations portion is support increased data gathering capacity across law enforcement agencies to increase accountability and ability to understand the frequency, type, and location of crimes. And then developing law enforcement agreements, cross commissions and one-way commissions, for example. And then make support services, shelters, and housing available for survivors and families in border towns and rural parts of the state. These recommendations that are listed here specifically came out of the New Mexico MMIWR report, supporting tribal justice systems with resources, training, and technical support. Even though this came out of the state report, this could easily be the same recommendations that could be set for the federal entities. Education, outreach, and other preventive measures are needed. Support community resources for strong responses. This includes grant opportunities for non-government organizations, providing tribal communities with technical assistance to develop community response plans, all of those things. So really, when it comes to racial injustice and systemic inequity, some of these things are starting to be addressed now. So we're very excited that we're at that point now that we can start addressing some of these things. And we have help from the federal level and the state level, with just because that at the national level, it's just been so, it's been illuminated that we need to address the issues of trafficking, the issues of missing people, the issue of murdered people for Native Americans. And we're very glad for that. And I just want to end You can go to the last slide. And I just want to end this by saying that, Native Americans, Indigenous peoples have always been resilient. And I'm just very, I'm looking forward to continuing the work that's being done. And so thank you.
Yeah, thank you, First Lady, for educating us on this very, very critical kind of portion of the holistic story of human trafficking. I think you're right. It's not something that we hear about a lot. So again, thank you for your time. And I do want to just quickly acknowledge and celebrate the fact that the Navajo Nation received the Presidential Award for combating human trafficking within the Havana Nation during 2020. So congratulations, and that's just a testament to you and your leadership and your dedication on really expanding the conversation further and helping us all be more educated on this. So once again, thank you, and thank you for being here. Okay, I see the time. I see the questions popping in, but we need to ask one more two-part question before kind of moving on to the questions for the audience. Especially in 2020, as the racial turmoil was at its peak here in the US, there was a lot of conversations, a lot of Instagram lives, a lot of Facebook lives on the conversation around leadership in spaces of social justice and in spaces of justice. And I wanted to quickly pose a question on leadership within the anti-trafficking movement, because I think there's a general understanding that we need representation, that we need Black, Indigenous, people of color in leadership and at the table, and we need representation. However, there needs to be a greater understanding of what actually including those voices mean. It's not just having a seat at the table, but actually giving them influential authority and putting them in positions of leadership to further make an impact. So it's moving from representation to inclusivity. So I want to ask a two-part question here, and I'm hoping that all of our panelists are happy to answer. But the question is, given the nature of the anti-trafficking movement being led primarily by white people, how can we continue to make room for Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC, to lead in this movement? So that's kind of the first part. And then the second part is, furthermore, how can we continue to support survivors who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color who want to lead in this movement? How do we make way? So two-part question there. And yeah, I'll ask that Kathy kind of starts us off.
I'm like, let me unmute this time so that you can.
Yeah, you're good.
No, that's a loaded question, but a very, very good question. It's a question that we're all trying to figure it out, right? Like, how do we do this? And I can tell you that, with the everything that happened in 2020 and everything that's happening now, just at the peak that we're not over yet, but we're just at this peak, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of emotionally driven and well-meaning individuals and agencies and organizations and companies are saying, they're taking a look at like, okay, how do we do this? So just out of kind of reactionary, it's kind of like, well, let me pick up the phone and let me call my Black counterparts, or let me call the people of color that I know, and let's hire them, or let's like bring them on, or let them start consulting or something like that. But even that is tricky, because you don't want to just do it out of like, hey, we need to fill these spots just because, we're at this peak. But you really need to take a look at, just cultural competence as a whole, right? You need, first, cultural competence starts with looking at self and figuring out, how, like, what does this really mean to me? How do I really not just include them and invite them and call them up, call every person of color that I know and invite them at our table, but like, I really want to get to know that culture. I really need to educate myself on what this looks like. I really need to educate myself on the, how they feel and what would it look like, you know, to work alongside them, like make a conscious effort, not just a emotionally driven effort to like invite everybody to the table. I think it's like I said, I think that it's great. I think that, you know, we're at a start, but we just have to be careful with that. I know me, myself personally, I got a lot of calls just being a Black survivor. And it was like, hey, can you consult or can you come up with like this diversity and equity and figuring out what we need to do with our company? And I'm like, well, let's take a step back and let's like think about why you're doing this. Are you doing this because of everything that happened? Or are you doing this because you genuinely believe that your organization needs to do this? Specifically in the anti-trafficking space, we can't pick and choose who we help, right? We can't pick and choose the survivors and the victims that we choose to serve. I mean, that we serve, we can't, we just can't, because if we're in it to fight trafficking, then we're just in it to fight trafficking as a whole. So if organizations and agencies are not representing, you know, those specific cultures, if they don't have Black people, if they don't have people of color and Indigenous people, then we need to, if you didn't have that before 2020, then you just need to reevaluate and think about what happened and why you're doing this. I think a very good thing would be to start with start with your agency, do a self-assessment, do an agency assessment to figure out where you want to go with this and what that looks like. And then when you're ready, start reaching out and have the conversations like this, uncomfortable conversations, and just figure out how to bring this awareness in your own agency. I know as an overcomer myself, it's cool, you know, when you click on a website, you know, if service providers offer awesome services and I'm looking for services and I click on a website and I see that, oh, there's Black people on this website, I can call them. But then I get into the services and nobody looks like me. The board doesn't look like me. Leadership never doesn't look like me. Now I'm starting to feel like you tricked me into coming into your services because you haven't made the effort to understand me. So definitely not just inviting people of color to the table, but allowing them to create their own tables and invite, you know, you got to figure out a way for them to invite you to their tables. So not just, hey, come to my table, but like, how can I get to your table? Because I really want to be culturally competent. I really want to understand what this culture is like, and just be honest with yourself. If you don't know, then you just don't know, but be honest with yourself and figure out how you can get to their tables, and let's all work together, right? So not just plucking people, because then that becomes tokenism, when you just plug people in positions just to make it seem diverse. So we just have to be careful and just be intentional about working together.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good call to everybody kind of in the anti-trafficking space, is that we want to move away from token representation or representation that's just tokenism. But then for you, what you're saying is to make sure that the intention behind moving towards inclusivity is there, and that we actually self-evaluate that portion of it, which is just so good. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Kathy. Okay, let's go ahead and hear from Paul. You know, Asian American, immigrant yourself, you work with the API population yourself, you know, helping human trafficking survivors. Would love to hear your same a response for the same kind of question. How can we continue to make space for BIPOC to lead the way in this movement, and specifically to raise BIPOC survivor leaders within the movement?
I want to say that, you know, the one of the most impactful, some of the most impactful speakers that I know were former victims and survivors now, and these survivors-led leaders have really great insights to share, but they also need our help in terms of addressing what are some of the exact issues that led to their enslavement. For example, the El Monte Thai slavery case that really helped launch the human trafficking movement. Many of the workers were basically promised, things that never happened. But what led to all of this? It was, if you looked at the underlying condition that really created these trafficking conditions, it was the unrealistic pricing models of of the garment industry. And if you look at how much amount was given per piece to create a piece of garment, that created downward pressure, so that businesses, contractors would cheat on their labor cost, and at some point, just not paying people seems to be the most cost-effective way of creating these garments for major retailers. So when I guess decision makers, those who set the pricing for their products, understand where their supply chain is coming from, who's working on their supply chains. This is one of those things where having people that has worked on the guys that actually sew the garments, the person that actually picked the cotton, those are the ones that you really need to have on the table. The one that picks the vegetables for the fruits, who gets up at 3 o'clock in the morning to pick vegetables for us, that gets onto our table in the morning. Those are the people that I think that needs to be at the table, telling us why, where they're living. They live. They do all this work for us. We protect. We are the consumers of their work, their sweat and toil. But they remain silent. They are the silent heroes that I think we need to have at the table. They may not be survivors or victims at this point, but they may be currently victimized, because of these unrealistic conditions, economic conditions forced upon them. These pricing, certainly, the pricing does not actually reflect the economic realities of what they're doing.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for sharing that insight. Okay, and then First Lady, would love to hear some of your thoughts on expanding leadership from the BIPOC community.
Yeah, just I would go back to what I was talking about. Like, we've seen what the federal initiatives and these state initiatives have produced, and a lot of it points back to it telling tribes that it really needs to be things initiated by them to find the solutions. Probably, it really takes analyzing your own systems internally, and then figuring out who, just doing a SWOT analysis almost of seeing where your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, and what really needs attention in terms of whether it's a criminal justice system, whether it's support services, whether it's finding and building capacity for nonprofits. It involves all of that. And so a lot of these things, and I guess in a way, that's what I meant by, as a nation, as an Navajo nation, we are fortunate to have our own government, our own land base, and that we're just really at that point now where we have enough information, and we have entities who want to help, who have resources, who have that information, and they have access to certain resources that we might not have as a tribe, but they're there to partner with us to really start helping us move forward with how we're going to address some of these things on our tribal lands. And then in terms of the second question of how do we support survivors, who want to lead in the movement, it really goes back to what Kathy was saying about involving them in these processes and really to get their insight, because as was mentioned before, if there's no criminal, there's no one criminal profile for who's perpetrating some of these crimes, then it really does depend on the information that we get from survivors and people who were rescued from human trafficking to give us that information. And just have Native tribes having the lack of data even to really see how prevalent, we don't even have an accurate landscape of what is going on, how, just to really have accurate numbers and how prevalent is it, where is this happening, who's it happening to, who is doing these things. We don't have that kind of information yet, and not at this point. But to get to from now to that point, we really need to initiate certain things to get that information, and we do need their help.
Thank you, First Lady. And so we are actually out of time. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to invite the panelists that if they are gracious enough to extend the conversation by answering questions on the Whova app from the panelists themselves, even though we can't have a larger kind of conversation of it. Kathy, a lot of the questions was on the report that you kind of referenced. So yeah, so maybe that's something that you could pull up. But I did want to leave with a critical resource that really has informed my process on learning the racial roots in the anti-trafficking movement. And I just posted it on the chat, and it is a UCLA law review on the racial roots of human trafficking. And I invite everybody to look at this research project. It dives deep into the linking past of commercial sex trafficking and linking it back to slavery, kind of like Kathy kind of mentioned in her presentation. So looking at disproportionality, the demand on racial fetish and stereotypes in slavery, maintaining supply, the sexual objectification of kids of color, and structure inequality. And then it even talks about the racial overview from the start of our anti-trafficking movement here in the United States, but specifically with sex trafficking. So it looks at the white slavery campaign. So this whole kind of notion that victims in the beginning of our movement were depicted as blonde, white children, and it goes deep into that. Again, there's some great stuff in that research study, so I just linked it on the chat if anybody wants to take a deeper look at it. And again, for the panelists, thank you so much for your time, for your expertise, for sharing personally and professionally and from the heart. And for all of our audience, if you are at all disturbed, and if you are at all uncomfortable with anything that was kind of mentioned, I ask that you kind of lean into that and continue to do research and continue to have transparent conversations with those that do not look like you. So that being said, once again, to our panelists, beautiful job. Thank you. It was an honor to be with you today. And I hope that the rest of the conference goes amazing. Thank you all.